Gulf Coordinating Council, Iraq and Iran, America's connection to those, analyses and assessments. Even though we're barraged with information on that area of the world, we probably do have a paucity of making connections between the major actors and the complexities in the area. We probably are a little short on analyses as well. Our speaker tonight is eminently qualified to make those great connections, and he knows the subtleties and the details of the area as well. He's a graduate of VMI, BA in History, a Master of Science degree in Foreign Service from Georgetown School of Foreign Service with distinction, PhD in International Studies in the Middle East from the Johns Hopkins School of International Studies. He taught for over a decade at SAIS on courses on the Middle East. He's also been an adjunct professor at Pennsylvania, Virginia, Texas, U.S. Naval Postgraduate School, and the Defense Intelligence College. He's lectured and consulted at the State Department and the Defense Department, and received several very interesting and outstanding awards for competence in those capacities. His commitment to the public service, I think, is impressive in terms of his fostering of improved relations between the United States and the Arab world. He's founded the organization which he presently presides over as president and as chief executive officer, the National Council on U.S.-Arab Relations. In addition to that, he's founded organizations that deal with Israeli-Palestinian peace, with the endeavor to foster education with respect to the Arab world, and with an increase of dialogue between businessmen, between statesmen and politicians, and citizens, between the United States and that part of the world. He's received many awards that are of interest and distinction. He's been knighted by the King of Morocco, and he's the only non-American to have been invited to every one of the leadership conferences of the Gulf Coordinating countries since 1981. A sign of enormous trust and confidence from people of that part of the world. He's published 4 books, 150 plus articles and monographs on the Arab world, on the Middle East, and the Islamic world. John Duke Anthony is one of the nation's foremost experts on the area. It's an enormous pleasure for me to present him to you. Dr. John Duke Anthony.
Thank you, Dr. Baird. And ladies and gentlemen, I'm sorry to pull you away from this nice sunset and the lovely shadows and hues and things that can be seen from this building better probably than any other place in Baltimore. I'm always pleased and honored to be invited to come here. This is my favorite international affairs, public affairs organization in dealing with our country's relations with peoples and cultures and other countries and their governments beyond our borders. And as I have mentioned on a few previous occasions, in the universe of just under 100 American World Affairs Councils, we've had programs, projects, events, activities with 2/3 of that number. And we recognize, applaud, and commend the important space and place that you have in our country's private sector. And hopefully, most, if not all of you, are engaged in dialogue, feedback, input, and comment to your elected representatives and appointed ones as well on issues pertaining to our country's relationship with the Arab countries, the Middle East, and the Islamic world. Because it is in all three that we have enormous needs, grave concerns, transparent and overarching interest, in objectives and relations. And as Dr. Byrd said in his opening remarks there, we're focusing more on analyses and assessments because I think you have the relevant quantity of facts and figures and numbers and information and insight. Indeed, we've been deluged with that nonstop every day for the last 6 years, and there's no sign of any early abatement in sight. So I will speak in the order that Dr. Byrd mentioned in terms of the 6 Gulf Cooperation Council countries. They are Kuwait, Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, the United Arab Emirates, and Oman. They established their sub-regional grouping inspired and patterned upon the European Union, not anything in the Western Hemisphere on the Americas as such. And they share in common with one another the fact that they all are dynastic, hereditary, ruling family, monarchical regimes. Each one is also an oil producer, from the behemoth of Saudi Arabia to the tinier than minuscule Bahrain. They are also stamped from a similar, if not always identical cloth in terms of their culture, their history, their needs in terms of modernization and development, and their weakness demographically, militarily, and otherwise against 2 mighty neighbors on the eastern side of the Gulf, namely Iraq and Iran, which we'll come to momentarily here. They are a good piece of news for the United States in a region that otherwise doesn't get very positive press, in the sense that they are all wedded to the dollar. Some other countries seeing the dollar in such a way that it perhaps should be replaced by the euro or some basket of currencies rather than putting all of their eggs and eggshells and embryos in the same Uncle Sam and Aunt Samantha's basket, over which they have virtually no control and oftentimes minuscule influence. They are also characterized largely by what has become a pejorative, controversial, and much misused term and concept, namely they are not extremist, or they are moderate, they are not radical. They're more predictable and conventional in terms of their policies, their positions, their actions, and their attitudes. And this is the kind of partner that one would prefer that would share all of those characteristics rather than an unruly, radical, extremist, volatile, unpredictable partner, friend, or ally. In common with these countries, indeed throughout the 22 Arab countries, the 28 Middle Eastern countries, the 57 Islamic countries, there is better news about Americans than I think the public media, the mainstream media would imply or indicate. And sometimes it seems as though good news, not sometimes, oftentimes, most times, good news is not media specific. In other words, if the plane lands safely, it doesn't garner a headline, to my knowledge, there. But the good news is not just that from a specialist and people of anecdotal knowledge and information, but rather it's been documented now for over half a decade by respected international polling groups, the Pew Charitable Trust, the Gallup polling organization, Zogby International, and many others who have scientifically surveyed attitudes and opinions and established thoughts and conventional wisdom from one region, end of the region to the other, from Morocco to Muscat, Baghdad to Berbera, Algiers to Aden, and Aleppo in between. And it has consistently been shown that Americans are high on the Richter scale of popularity and approval and emulation in the following areas there. The freedom of the country, the freedom of the American people. In addition, the productivity of the United States, as well as the depth and breadth of science in the United States, and the way that Americans, more than any other people on the planet, are able to take scientific ideas and inventions and innovations and bring them to market, bring them to fruition, make them have an impact not just on a country's well-being, but its individual citizens as well. And on top of that, has to do with some of the more mundane aspects in terms of American music is alive and well from one end of the region to the other. That's seen as a plus, but though some may take issue with that. And also American fashion to a degree, with which one may also take issue in terms of baseball caps and T-shirts and jeans there. These are still much in demand throughout the region as a whole. But on top of these aspects are those in which the United States excels, and strategically it wishes to continue to excel, namely that it is seen as either the number one or between Avis and Hertz, almost the number one or the number two in terms of its economic prowess, its financial prowess, its industrial prowess, its technological prowess, and its military prowess. These 5 things are enormous, humongous, that no other country can really rival or compete with there. So they're aware of this, and they want to be associated with it, if at all possible, identified with it, to have an intimate, close relationship and a mutuality of benefit, a reciprocity of reward, a mutuality of advantage, but oftentimes politics and war and the absence of peace get in the way of that. With regard to the 6 GCC countries, there are 8 countries in the Persian Gulf. 7 of the 8 are Arab. The one that is not a member of the Gulf Cooperation Council from the beginning and is unlikely to become a member of it at any foreseeable situation in the future is Iraq. But of the 8 in the region, the GCC countries possessed half of all of the known hydrocarbon oil and gas reserves known to humankind. And that's to be stacked against America's having 2 3/4% of all of the world's known oil and gas. And figures can be slippery, but in this case, I will suggest some that give us a frame of comparison. Throughout much of the 1990s and also the 1980s, the United States and Saudi Arabia alone were pretty much the same in terms of the daily production of oil. 7 billion barrels a day of oil was what was the norm and the average throughout roughly 15 years. But for the United States to get its 7 million barrels a day, it came from 650,000 oil wells, every one of them driven by a pump, which is an extra electricity or energy cost, as well as steel and iron and lubricants on the pumps. Saudi Arabia got its 7 million barrels a day of oil from fewer than 800 wells. So it took us 650,000 wells, took them 800 wells. The average production of an American well has ranged in the area of 12 barrels a day. The average production of Saudi Arabia's, Abu Dhabi's, and Kuwait's is 12,000 barrels a day, and no pumps. When we find it, which is rare, the challenge is to get it out of the ground. When they find it, which is frequent, the challenge is to keep it in the ground. So these are facts, these are geological realities, and facts are stubborn things. They have implications for policies, for positions, for actions, and attitudes. In this particular region, my wife used to be the leading person in the United States government in the private sector context for Americans investing and trading and having goods and services and technology cooperation with those 6 countries, at which point we had around 50,000 Americans in the region and some 500 companies. I can tell you that in the last 3 years alone, the number has jumped by 50%. We are now 750 companies in the region. And whereas most Americans persisted in seeing these countries and what they have and where they are and what they do, largely in inanimate terms, namely as objects to be controlled, manipulated, dominated, influenced. not as actors in their own right, but their own legitimate needs, concerns, and interests and objectives and relations there. But we also saw them as mountains of money, rather than the heirs, the descendants, the children, the progeny of the three monotheistic faiths, Judaism and Christianity. We are of a people echoing usually the phrase that we are the children of the Judeo-Christian heritage and culture. That's true, but it's only 2/3 true. We are the children, the progeny of the Judeo-Christian Islamic culture, and far more so of the last one named than most Americans are aware, and far more intensively and extensively as well, for 8 centuries indeed, from 711 AD to 1492, almost 4 times as long as we've been a country. The language of science and technology was Arabic. And when Columbus set sail to find the short route to India, and of course, thank God he got lost, and here we are this evening. There were no English speakers, to my knowledge, on his vessels, but there were 3 who were fluent in Arabic, because the Indian Ocean, through which he expected to navigate, the land surrounding the Indian Ocean, the knowledge of science and technology and navigation was Arabic and not English as such. Most Arabs and Muslims know this. Perhaps 1% of Americans know this, and we don't learn it until we get to adulthood, if we learn it there. Moving from that relatively roseate picture with these 6 countries that are with us, in terms of their governments, not necessarily their peoples. Because when Americans ask the question, why do they, meaning all Arabs and Muslims usually lumped together, hate us so much? These polls that I've indicated show the opposite. It is not hatred of Americans or America. It is distaste, hatred of America's policies. And this is the rub. And this makes this evening's event rather controversial there, because some people see this one way or another. And there's no unanimity of perception, I believe, here, or understanding or knowledge or agreement on what I just said there. If we move to the situation in Iraq, explicitly and by implication, issues of concern that require our adult attention and supervision and oversight and engagement and involvement of Iran, one can say the following, and I'm just putting out material here so that we can have a discussion, a cerebral massage, if you will, after I finish babbling away up here. How did we get to where we are in the situation we are in Iraq? And so many people have a one sentence or one factor, one source answer to why did we do what we did? And isn't it a quagmire? Aren't we losing? Isn't this the most humiliating thing we've ever done? Isn't this the worst chapter in our country's foreign relations and international affairs? Just asking that question would provoke adrenaline and the juices flowing amongst many there. If it is true that last autumn's elections nationally sent a clarion call for withdrawal from Iraq, or an exit strategy, or ending this in the most honorable, expeditious, rapid, and efficient manner as possible, and I think that is probably a documented fact. The additional fact is that we're still there. And I will make the case that we don't intend to leave. And I will also make the case, but this is my analysis and my assessment, you can disagree with me, and I would welcome that. I'd love to even be proven wrong. One further, is that many who pushed and pressured and lobbied and cajoled and connived and contrived to do what we did on March 19th, 2003, believe that we have largely won, or in terms of their needs, their concerns, their interests, their objectives, those have been largely won. Now, to this winning thing with quotations around it, because it's an opinion now, it's not a documented fact, is Plan A and Plan B. Plan A would have a certain set of victories. But if they can't be obtained, or achieved, or accomplished all, then Plan B ain't so bad. So I will address A and B, okay? Plan A was to create a situation where we would put our consultants and advisors, as specialists, if you will, in the Iraqi ministries of petroleum, economy, and finance, as advisors, just to be partners and be there to lend a hand, provide us some assistance, have a little input and comment, be devil's advocate, be a sounding board, just talk about things that needed to be done and how one might do this. Number two was to position Americans in those ministries, bureaus, agencies, departments, offices that would deal with matters pertaining to external defense and domestic security. I need not state the obvious, that the contracts let by these ministries in most countries are megabuck in their denominations there. Thirdly was to cover ourselves on the diplomatic front and swamp any and all others combined by having the world's largest embassy on the planet, the largest in history, with 1,000 employees at the embassy, of which to date 6 are known to be fluent in Arabic. With regard to the industries of development and electricity and sewage and water and road building and maintenance and river desilting and harbor construction and airport construction and interstate highway type of situations, we have put our people in all of those agencies and offices and bureaus and departments as well. Because this is key to design and engineering and construction and procurement, hopefully of American goods and services. To position ourselves militarily within the country so that whereas we no longer are in Saudi Arabia, which provided us enormous geostrategic depth against both Iraq as well as Iran, and the replacement or the substitute has been Qatar, which has no geostrategic depth, but Iraq would requires what we have been doing, and that is building mega bases in Iraq to American weights, standards, specifications, and related technical, scientific dynamics of what goes into how to maintain something, how to build something, how to sustain it as such. The analogy here would be that, let's just say we were invaded and occupied by some Asian countries' troops, and the Asian spokespeople in Shanghai or Beijing and elsewhere would say, we won't stay a minute longer. These are all temporary. There, we'll leave as soon as the job is done. We won't prolong our presence. This has nothing to do with an imperial footprint. And for you even to use that in your vocabulary shows that you're unpatriotic, etc. This would be of interest if we saw the representative of that fictional Asian country's troops building bases to Asian standards in St. Louis, Baltimore too, Philadelphia, Atlanta, Chicago, Dallas, Fort Worth, Houston, Denver, San Diego, Los Angeles, San Francisco. Okay, but we're not leaving. We're not leaving. We are there only temporarily. We have no permanent bases there. Those of you who served in the Persian Gulf before, and perhaps served in and out of Bahrain, will remember the nice figment that the English majors came up with. We don't have a permanent base there. What we have is an administrative support unit. That nothing could be more bland and innocuous. And if you read the fine print, we have unlimited usage of those facilities and support units. If you have unlimited uses, that means you can stay there all the time. Okay. There's also an even more visionary aspect of being in a country which is the land of the two rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates. Because many people say, won't the future wars be about water as much as they will be about oil or gas? This has been bandied about now for 10 or 20 years. And it is known that a number of countries have wanted to have access to Iraq's water, and the Iraqis themselves have been willing to give this serious and favorable consideration. Although up until now, there are 119 rivers in the world that cross international borders and boundaries, and none of them charge the people downstream for the water that goes to them. This idea has been introduced in the last decade by the Israelis and by the Turks. And so there may come a time when the Iraqis will indeed be willing to provide and share their water resources with those in Arabia and elsewhere. If not free, then as a part of a grand bargain where there's some other advantage that offsets it there. Indeed, I know the Israelis talked to Saddam Hussein through intermediaries about precisely this in the 1980s. Took some 5 different congressional delegations to Iraq in the 1980s. And this was very much on the agenda, that in a peace arrangement where the Iraqis would provide not just water, but also oil and gas to Israel. And a pipeline would go all the way down to Aqaba in Jordan with spurs off to Israel. And in the run-up to the American invasion of Iraq, an understood consensus between some of the Iraqis that we hope to install in power and some Israelis were that the pipeline from Mosul to Haifa would be reopened, and another pipeline would come to Israel and to Jordan as well. And this is hardly written about, but you can see the palpable objective and subjective rationality to it, because in all of Arabia, all of the 6 that I mentioned, and then throw in Yemen as well, there's not one single river, not one perennially flowing stream, nary a brook, scarcely a creek, hardly an estuary, barely a pond, not a pool. I've never seen a puddle. So the need, the interests, the mutually advantageous mix would be obvious there. But it's also having to do with the Iraqi oil and gas and future petrochemicals industry. We don't know the extent of it because Iraq has not been opened for seismic surveys and other testing there, but the estimates that in today's monetary terms, somewhere between 10 and 30 trillion dollars, just in Iraq alone. We're coming to Iran momentarily here. At the moment, there are some 85 known oil fields, of which around 19 are in production. And if I have my figures right, I believe 9 are in production in the south, in the overwhelmingly Shia area, and 8 are in the Kurdish areas in the north, and 1 or 1.5 is in the middle, in the area where Baghdad is. We do not know much about the western area of Iraq, Al-Anbar province, which has been much in the news and from which people have been trying to extrapolate things that apply to Iraq as a whole. With regard to the support for the dollar that I mentioned earlier, one of the heads of state summit I attended in Bahrain in 2002, on Friday, Saddam Hussein announced that future oil sales would be denominated in euros, not dollars. Places like across the street at T. Rowe Price and elsewhere went through the roof, and celestial limits looked like they were in the basement, in the sense that this must not happen if it all can be prevented. By Monday, he had reversed himself. But Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, Iran's president, has already arranged for a euro burst in Iran in order to get away from the dollar. Now, this is hardly written about except among specialists in financial analysis and strategic investment advisors. But imagine this in the sense of how crucial it is to the ongoing preeminence of the American banking system and financial structures worldwide, not to mention the hedge funds, the stock market, and the like. It's one thing when people denominate their exports in our currency, because when we are short of it, we know how to print it. But if it's in somebody else's currency, we would have to get into the counterfeiting business. And we would prefer not to do that. It would not be the best position for people to try to defend as such. So the good news is indeed the GCC part, but it's mixed even there, because they're scared to death, to use an American jargonistic phrase, that the chaos that we have induced in Iraq could spread. And the three that are the most fearful are Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, and Bahrain. Of those three, two are land neighbors of Iraq, the others are not. You might say that, well, Bahrain being an archipelago should not be as afraid, and yet it is as afraid, if not more afraid, because inside of Bahrain's demographic population and citizenry base is something most Americans are unaware of. Until March 19th, 2003, there were two countries in the world where the citizens of that country, in the majority, were Shia Arab Muslims, but they were not in control. Now there's only one. It's Bahrain. And this is where the U.S. Fifth Fleet is anchored and centered, and the naval component of U.S. Central Command is centered. And Bahrain's Shia, officially, even officials will say is 60%. Most specialists would say it's at least 75%, if not more. And so Bahrain has had more civil and industrial and politically related unrest related to that fact that I just gave you than all of the others combined. And yet it's played an outsized role in regional and international affairs and been a bilateral partner to the United States, unlike a few others that might come to mind. Indeed, since 1949, there hasn't been a day that the United States has not had a major, or symbolic at first, but became major, naval presence rooted in Bahrain as such. As to the dichotomy between the officially stated reasons for going into Iraq and the actual ones, this needs to be italicized, capitalized, deon-sized here, because this is part and parcel to the animus towards the United States in terms of its official policies and its positions and its pomposity and its pontificating with regard to principles and its intrusive behavior and trying to impose or instill democratic structures, systems, processes, principles in these countries here. The stated ones were to end, discover, rid, destroy Iraq's weapons of mass destruction, to bring freedom to the Iraqi people, to improve the material lot of the Iraqi population, to deal a blow to OPEC, to lower the price of internationally traded oil, to establish in Iraq a democracy that would be a beacon for the rest of the region, and to deal a blow to terrorism. These were the seven that come immediately to mind. Every one of them pretty much smashed to smithereens. The actual ones were amongst those I just mentioned there. And these were not drawn out of a pocket or top hat at the last minute. The roots of them in terms of my work as a person devoted to my country's national service in the way I have served it, largely as a civilian, but I am a former soldier. And indeed, I was a soldier at age 17. And for my limited IQ, when I got out of the Army, I enrolled in a military academy. as a veteran. There were two of us. We did stand out in that regard, but not necessarily in terms of the cerebral component of the decision behind the action. So I'll be happy to speak to that if you like. The wish to gain a certain set of circumstances by 2020, when the Soviet Union imploded, disintegrated largely peacefully, was almost simultaneous to the, well, actually right at the very end of the Soviet defeat in Afghanistan, where the Red Bear was brought to its knees through ourselves, through Pakistan, through Saudi Arabia, through many others as such there. The strategic visionaries in our country, many of them are still in government service, thought that they would have a long-range view. What do we need to have by 2020 going in order to still be number one? And they answered it in the 5 things I just mentioned, being number one economically, financially, industrially, technologically, and militarily. But the push question to it was, well, what do we have to have in order to have that? Well, something misleading tilted towards that in the 1992 election with bumper stickers that said it's, on the Clinton side at least, it's the economy, stupid. But if erudition and profundity of insight was the objective, the bumper sticker might have been it's the energy, stupid. Because all economies run on energy, rich, poor, new, old, big, small, and everything in between there. And then the third push question was, whose energy, where? And the answer was overwhelmingly in the Persian Gulf, which says 70%. No one quibbles with the statistics there, and as I said, we have 2 3/4%. And you stack that up against our being the world's single largest users of that commodity, single largest importers of it, single largest wasters of it, and single largest crybabies in terms of our relationship or terms of trade with it, and you will have some background and insight that is useful here. The short-term, medium-term strategy was one called dual containment. And I was asked to comment on both of these strategies, so I'm not just making them up or reading somebody else's work there. When they went draft stage, I was asked to, what do you think? What do you think? What do you think? And so the other one was driven largely by Paul Wolfowitz. The election in 92 occurred there, but you went into 1991, and the inauguration was not into 1993, okay? After the even-numbered years, the inauguration comes in an odd-numbered year there. And he authored or drafted, or was the lead drafter for what was called Defense Policy Guidelines there. And this was that the United States had to, yes, have these 5 things going for it, but it also had to be watchful that others would be competitors. And we had to, like King on the Mountain, for those who played this game in school, where one person could be up on top and everybody tried to pull her or him down. The person on the top, to remain on the top, had to keep everybody from getting on the top there. This meant to block them. This meant to circumvent them. This meant to hit them with fait accompli. This meant sometimes to outspin them, to outlead them, to out-technological advancement them, whatever it took. And Reagan had this idea with regard to the Soviet Union, and it worked, that component of it there. So it wasn't due even in that regard there. But the ones being watched were Russia and China, primarily. And there comes an aspect of France, because France was in the same situation that I'm going to come to shortly with regard to Russia, okay? Those goals could not be obtained short of a word I've not yet used, regime change in Iraq. And they cannot be obtained in Iran without regime change. I would love to be disabused of this, but this is how I see it from the many meetings I've sat in over these decades. This theme is over and over and over and over and over. And so with the regime having been changed in Iraq, at least Plan B has been achieved so far, and the jury is out on how much of Plan A will be achieved, if any, or most, or some, or all of it there. But Plan B has been attained. What's the evidence for that? We ghost wrote, drafted a new constitution for Iraq. Okay? And in that constitution, it has 18 provinces. We allowed any 3 provinces to veto anything that they didn't like about the other 15. It so happens that 3 of the 18 provinces are Kurdish. Okay? They have their de facto autonomous republic in the north of Iraq as it is. And we have supported that. And the Israelis have mightily supported it. And there was a day when the Iranians mightily supported it, but the Iranians stopped supporting it March 15th, 1975, okay? In this aspect of it, we rewrote the Constitution to say that any of the regionally autonomous provinces are free to grant their own oil and gas concessions. That's never been done before in Iraq since 1961. This is a dream of the American private sector. If you're in the private sector, an investor, if you make your money from this kind of thing, you're to be understood, applauded, forgiven, certainly recognized as having logic and rationale and self-interest on your sleeve in this regard. The problem is we don't yet have a legal foot on which to stand. But the French do, and the Russians do, and the Chinese do. The French and the Russians both have sovereign signed concessions by Iraq for access to its oil and gas. We have nothing. China has sovereign initialed memoranda of understanding to take it to the next level of access to Iraq's oil and gas. We have nothing. We have so far blocked those 3. So when you think, well, why is France in there with Russia? Because theirs is the exact same. Both of them are owed billions from their support for Iraq to keep it from being defeated by Iran during the 1980-88 Iran-Iraq war. France, when the war ended, was owed $12 billion. France is 1/4 of the United States. That would mean $48 billion be owned by the United States. And then add to that 17 years of interest compounded as to what France is owned. Put yourself in the shoes of a French statesperson, investor, somebody who holds that debt. And Russia's was comparable as such. Again, we have nothing in terms of this. But by rewriting the Constitution, we have already seen the Kurdish government in the north award several oil concessions to Norwegian firms. And then 3 weeks ago, they awarded one to a friend of the president, the Hunt Oil Company. So far, these have come to naught because in the rules and regs associated with the new laws and Constitution, the permits for drilling and supplies and resupplies have got to be given by the central government in Baghdad. And it is the central government that sees itself the most beleaguered with a separatist-like Southern Shia movement with at least 9 in the much more accessible fields than the Kurdish areas in the north, which are in mountainous areas more so, and more difficult fields to operate there. So we'll switch real quickly to Iran to see your interest and needs and viewpoints on that. And my opening statement would be that the same crowd that brought you Iraq are the playwrights and choreographers of what they would hope to bring about in terms of Iran. There are many things similar, but there are enough things that are different so that you can say it's not a cookie-cutter type of thing there. To begin with, Iran is 3 times as populous as Iraq, 4 times as large as Iraq has 11 neighbors. Saudi Arabia has 13. Do the arithmetic on this. So from the point of view of investors and people who are purveyors of goods and services, this is a substantially bigger market than Iraq's at that level. Then factor in that Iraq has the world's second largest reserves of gas. And gas is increasingly popular. It's cleaner. Environmentalists, ecologists appreciate it. And it also can sustain one's petroleum resources longer if you have a mix of gas there. And there are many people in the gas side of the business. Then add into the picture the fact that Iraq has only 48 miles of coast on the Persian Gulf. Iran has more than 500 miles on the Gulf. And Iran has 19 ports, none of them much to write home about, but 19 or 19 versus Iraq having 2. Okay? And this last year, going to the summit, 2 things stood out for me. And also when I took a delegation of U.S. Central Command officers to the region in April for the last 2 years. I've taken more than 100 officers for our Commander-in-Chief to the region for access and exposure. They're good soldiers, but they don't know a lot about the culture, the history, the heritage, the language, the ethnicity, the politics, the elites, the decision-making. And the first one, this last December the 11th at the GCC Heads of State Summit, which was in Riyadh, they rotate, was the same joke as the one the year before in Abu Dhabi, which is we're still trying to figure out how is it that Uncle Sam and Aunt Samantha attacked Iraq militarily and Iran won. And we're trying to figure that one out. And we've gone back to our historians and our libraries and our archives, and we cannot find anything like that, not only in this century, but the last one and the one before that there. And as the run-up to it, the U.S. brought down Iran's other adversary to the east, the Taliban in Afghanistan. What's going on here? So there's that aspect of it. But in terms of what I did, I arranged in December to fly back over Iran and Iraq at night in the pitch dark. You can do this with a little research. And I put myself by the windows there. And I used to live and work in Iran. I started out as an Iran specialist, and I've been to Iraq a number of times there. And I thought, what are we talking about here on the oil and gas side? At around 4,000 wells, I stopped counting. All of them were flared with the orange bursts that used to be the case in Kuwait, Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, and Qatar, and the UAE, but are no longer. Because most oil is produced with gas. And for decades, it has been flared at the wellhead and hence lost to commercial and industrial use because they went to markets and it requires billions of investment and many years of visionary strategic decision makers too. All of it's waiting to be developed in Iraq and Iran, okay? And no one would deny that the United States has the best technology in terms of production and discovery and pipelining and management and databases and markets and refineries and you name it there. So this is the prize that is looming there to be had. But how could it happen if you do not change the regime and put in place a group of leaders who are beholden to you for your having enabled them to be in power? And this would be the quid pro quo there. On objective grounds, it might happen without chicanery and politicking and conniving and contriving. That is to say, in an open level field, the American bidders would probably win against the Japanese, Korean, Taiwanese, Russian, Venezuelan, Canadian, and other ones there. But it is the nature of the beast that people would rather control, if they possibly can, rather than rely upon others, however good the relationship might be. And as to the frame of reference for that, here I think we have 3 policy options or alternatives. One is to develop our own alternative sources of fuels. and to also engage in conservation or greater efficiencies in terms of emissions and miles per gallon, et cetera. And there is a school of thought and a movement that's behind that. And the second one would be to recognize reality, accept facts for facts. Most of Europe does, most of Asia does, most of the rest of the planet does, in the sense that OPEC's members own 85% of all of the petroleum that we're talking about here. That governments do. We're the oddball. We're the unique one. We're the exception. We're the aberration. We're trying to bring Iraq into a milieu on this front for reasons I think I've indicated here. So we could accommodate that reality and just try to negotiate the best deal we could. And we would be in a better negotiating position than anybody. Because I said we're the number one users, the number one importers of this. And you probably have close to 1 million Arabs in these oil ministries, in these governments who've been educated here. In Saudi Arabia alone, you have more than 200,000 who've gotten their degrees here. That's the low figure. There are more American-trained PhDs in Saudi Arabia's cabinet than there are PhDs of any kind in the U.S. cabinet, the Senate, the Supreme Court, and the House of Representatives combined. And these were their formative, impressionable years there. You had them in your home. You maybe had some here, there. And so they are pro-American in the core there, that other countries don't have so much going for them. But we've decided not to do that, and we've decided largely not to do the first one. And the third one is to seize control of it. Because with control of it, you can plan, you can anticipate, you can predict, you can hedge your bets, you can rely on it. And now many people who say, well, the oil is fungible, and they got to sell it, and that's their only product. We sell 1,128 categories of goods internationally. These countries sell only 7 categories. It's a massive discrepancy there. But that's misleading, and yet I've read that perhaps more than anything. If you go back to the A and the B, the control of it, if you're an oil person, this gives you a word that's a phrase that's come into my vocabulary in the last 10 years, namely bookable reserves. And with bookable reserves on your book, your stock price goes up. You can leverage that better, not necessarily as collateral, but you're more credible than the one that doesn't have it when they go in to get a loan or an adrenaline fix in terms of spreading out payments or amortizing this and writing off that and underwriting this and subsidizing that. And not to mention the unmentionable, the strategic geopolitical aspect that for the last 100 years, the world has run on oil and gas. And for Americans more than anybody on the planet, it's been key to American standard of living since at least World War II until the present as such. And the British long before in World War II mentioned that oil is the strategic prize. Whoever controls it, whoever dominates it, is more assured of global economic and political domination. And so this is an aspect of it which is not mentioned in polite company or in public dialogue very much. And it's not the sole driver of it. There's a coalition of drivers here. Those who wanted to behave like a superpower. As Richard Pearl said, being a superpower ought to have some advantages there, being the only one. And Madeleine Albright, we are the world's sole indispensable superpower. And I've told you about the strategic games to prolong that as much as possible. If this century is supposed to be the century for China, well, there are those who are forgiven for wanting to prolong the last century for as far into the future as possible as the American century. We're at 6:55. I'll stop here because I hope I provoked you enough. And I'd like to take, if I could, with your permission, 3 questions at a time. In the past, sometimes I've done more, but 3 I think would be fair. And I'll answer those 3, and then I'll go to another 3, and I'll repeat the questions. Who would like to go first? No, all three of those good questions. On the first one, with regard to Saudi Arabia's strategic commitment following on its conviction to further its modernization and development in association with the best brains and brightest talents available. Yes, this is not new. It has now more financial wherewithal to devote to that than ever before. But it is on the backs of perhaps a 50-year visionary dream of making the country go in the modernization and developing area there, and in association largely with the United States of America. The country's educational system is rightly to be criticized, and resoundingly criticized. And in the aftermath of 9/11, there were many commissions set up to go through every textbook, et cetera, and I sat in on some of the end results of these meetings there. And the consensus seemed to be that, well, 85% of our curriculum we're not going to change. We apologize to no one on this. This is factual, it's history, it's a culture, it's a heritage. 5% of it made our hair stand on end, and it embarrassed us. It shamed us. We were scandalous not to have had oversight on this, et cetera. And it's going if it's not already gone. We're getting rid of it. It's terrible. Another 10% of it just needs some tweaking, rewriting and editing as such. And as to, we're guilty as charged of not being on top of this as such. But we remember that in the 50s, in the heated times of the Cold War, that the United States, indeed all of our Western allies, tried to get us to do whatever was possible not to encourage anything on the left in terms of Marxist-Leninism, socialism, Baathism, Nasserism, communism, et cetera. And we went overboard. In fact, we took from Egypt, we have a small population still, but we took from Egypt, which doesn't have a small population, many of those who were expelled from Egypt who were good teachers, but they were from the Muslim Brother extremist far-right ilk, and they became the teachers, and they wrote the textbooks, et cetera. And so shame on us for doing that, because the world has changed. The train has left the station there. We're aware of it. We're embarrassed by it, we're ashamed of it, but we're doing what we can about it as fast as we can. And this gentleman's question put his finger on what is the most recent aspect of this publicly announced strategic commitment. The government of Iraq, people of Iraq feel, I appreciate the question, and there might be some speakers here who would say, well, they feel this, that, and the other, A, B, C, D, E, F, G. But what if somebody were to ask somebody in an American Studies program in the Sorbonne in France,